When I was 56, my son had me sign a power of attorney on my hospital bed, secretly sold my house, and abandoned me with $200 in a note. You always land on your feet, Mom. 8 years later, my 17-year-old granddaughter stumbled upon an article about my business in a famous magazine. That night, she quietly placed the article in front of her father, a story about a successful businesswoman who had rebuilt everything from scratch. Weeks later, the son who had callously deserted me walked through the door of everything I had built, holding a cashier's check and breaking down in tears. Thank you for choosing to spend your time here. That means everything. Tell me in the comments where in the world are you watching from, your country, your city. Let's see how far this family reaches. Portions of this story include fictional elements added for narrative and educational purposes. Any likeness to particular names or settings is coincidental, but the message it carries is one I hope stays with you long after it ends. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I was 56 years old the morning I signed away the last thing that could protect me. I didn't know that then. I know it now. That Tuesday started the way most of my Tuesdays did. Coffee at 6, the old percolator Gerald had bought at a yard sale in 1987, the magnolia tree in the backyard, catching the early light. Gerald had planted that tree the year we moved in, 28 years ago. It was taller than the house now, and on quiet mornings I liked to believe he had planned it that way. I had just set my mug in the sink when the pain hit. It started low, a dull pressure beneath my ribs that I had been ignoring for 3 weeks. But this time it did not pass. This time it dropped me against the counter with both hands gripping the edge and my breath coming in short, ragged pulls. I called Ryan. He answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep. Mom, what's wrong? I need you to take me to the hospital, I said, keeping my voice steady, the way I always had. 31 years of motherhood had taught me that much. He was at my door in 20 minutes. Diane sat in the passenger seat and waved when I came down the steps. Ryan took my arm without being asked. I told myself that meant something. At Savannah Memorial, Dr. Patterson pressed carefully along my abdomen, reviewed the scan, and delivered the news with the practiced calm of a man who had said difficult things so many times that difficulty no longer showed on his face. Acute gastric perforation. Surgery today, not tomorrow. How serious? Ryan asked, arms crossed, knee finally still for once. Serious, Dr. Patterson said, but very manageable at this stage. Before they took me back, a woman from hospital administration placed a document in front of me, a durable power of attorney, a legal form valid in Georgia. Even if I became incapacitated, authorizing someone I trusted to handle financial and legal matters while I could not. Medical bills, insurance paperwork, anything that needed a signature. Who would you like to designate? She asked. I looked at Ryan. My son, I said, and signed without hesitation. I want to be clear, the document itself was not the betrayal. A durable power of attorney was designed for moments exactly like this one. A mother going under anesthesia, trusting the person she had raised to hold things together while she couldn't. The form was built on love. What a person chooses to do with that kind of trust, that is where betrayal lives. But I did not know that yet. They let Ryan walk me as far as the pre-op doors. He hugged me in the hallway. I patted his cheek the way I had when he was small, told him I would be fine. He said he knew I would. As the orderly wheeled me through the double doors, I turned back to look at my son one last time. He stood with one hand raised in a half-wave, watching me go. There was something in his expression I could not name. Not grief, not worry. Something quieter, something that looked from a distance almost like relief. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that for a very long time after. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was the ceiling. White tiles, fluorescent light, the faint hum of a machine somewhere to my left. My mouth tasted like metal, and my throat burned from the breathing tube they had used during surgery. For a moment, I simply lay there waiting for my mind to catch up with my body, letting the room come into focus, one piece at a time. Then I turned my head toward the chair beside my bed. It was empty. I told myself Ryan was getting coffee. That was what I told myself on day one. He was in the cafeteria, or parking the car, or stepping outside to take a phone call. I watched the door and waited. Nurses came and went. Dinner arrived on a tray I barely touched. The light outside my window shifted from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early evening. Ryan did not come. On day 3, a young woman in blue scrubs stopped in my doorway and knocked lightly on the frame, even though the door was already open. She had a kind face and the careful eyes of someone who noticed things other people missed. Mrs. Ellis, I'm Clara. I'll be your nurse for the next few days." She came in and checked my IV line, made a small adjustment, then looked at me the way very few people had looked at me in a long time, like she actually saw me. "Is there anything you need?" "I'm fine," I said, because that was still my default answer. She nodded, but she didn't leave. Instead, she straightened the blanket at the foot of my bed, checked the monitor readings a second time, and said quietly, "My shift ends at 7, but I'll stop back before I go." She did. Every night for 14 days, Clara Webb stopped back before she went home. Sometimes she stayed 5 minutes. Sometimes she stayed an hour sitting in that empty chair and talking with me about nothing important. Her apartment, a book she was reading, the best place in Savannah to get peach cobbler. She never made me feel pitied. She made me feel like a person, which in those 14 days was harder to come by than I would have liked to admit. On day 7, I asked her to try Ryan's number from the nurse's station phone, thinking perhaps my son wasn't recognizing the hospital's number on his caller ID. Clara came back 10 minutes later. Her expression told me everything before she said a word. "No answer," she said. "I left a message." I nodded and looked out the window. "Thank you for trying." She sat down without being asked. We didn't talk about Ryan after that. We didn't need to. On day 9, Dorothy Hargrove walked through my door carrying a tin of homemade biscuits and wearing the expression of a woman who had already made up her mind about something. Dot had lived next door to me for 22 years. She had been at Gerald's funeral. She had brought me soup every Thursday for the first month after he died. When she saw the empty room, no flowers, no cards, no visitors' coats draped over the chair, her jaw tightened in a way I recognized. "Where is he?" she asked. "Dot, Margaret Ellis, where is your son?" I didn't answer. She sat down across from me, opened the biscuit tin and placed it on my tray table without another word. Then she took out her phone and made a call I couldn't quite hear. When she came back to her chair, her voice was softer. "I called Pastor Whitfield. He's got a room. It'll be ready when you need it." I started to tell her I wouldn't need it, but the words didn't come, because some part of me already knew. On the morning of day 14, Dr. Patterson signed my discharge paperwork and told me I was healing well. Clara came in to remove my IV line. She worked slowly, more slowly than usual, and when she pressed the small bandage over the puncture site, she held my hand between both of hers for just a moment longer than necessary. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I had been trying not to put a name to for 2 weeks. "Clara," I said, "what do you know that I don't?" She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said very quietly, "I think you should let me drive you home." Clara drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that smelled like pine air freshener and fast food wrappers she had clearly tried to hide under the seat. She kept both hands on the wheel and didn't talk much, which I appreciated. I watched Savannah move past the window, the oak trees draped in Spanish moss, the old brick storefronts, the church steeples rising above the rooftops, and I tried to remember the last time I had noticed how beautiful this city was. We turned onto my street. I knew something was wrong before Clara even slowed the car. There was a moving truck, not a large one, a rental the kind college kids use, parked in front of my house. But it wasn't moving anything out. It was parked and empty. And on the front porch, where my ceramic pot of geraniums had lived for 11 years, there was a stroller I had never seen before. "Clara," my voice came out smaller than I intended. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Maggie." She pulled to the curb. I sat there for a moment with my hands folded in my lap, looking at the house I had painted myself the summer after Gerald died, because I needed something to do with my hands and my grief. Pale yellow with white trim. I had stood on that ladder for 3 days straight. I got out of the car. The front door opened before I reached the porch steps. A young woman stood in the doorway, maybe 30 years old, holding a dish towel. Behind her, I could hear the sound of a television and a child laughing. She looked at me with this specific expression of someone who had been told to expect me and was hoping I would make this easy. "Mrs. Ellis," she said. "Yes." She stepped aside and reached for something on the entryway table. A white envelope. She held it out to me with both hands, the way you hand something to a person when you feel guilty about what's inside it. "Your son left this for you," she said. "I'm so sorry. We didn't know the full situation when we—" She stopped, started again. "I'm just very sorry." I took the envelope. I did not open it on the porch. I turned around and walked back to Clara's car and sat down and stared at my name written on the front in Ryan's handwriting. The same handwriting I had watched him practice at our kitchen table when he was 7 years old. Big looping letters that had eventually straightened into something sharp and efficient, just like him. I opened it. $200. crisp bills folded once, and beneath them a piece of notepaper torn from a legal pad. 7 words in blue ink. "You always land on your feet, Mom." I read it once, then again. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Clara said nothing. She reached over and put her hand over mine, and I let her, because there are moments when the only honest thing you can do is let someone else hold the weight for just a minute while you catch your breath. From across the street, a screen door banged open. Dot Hargrove came down her porch steps moving faster than a 70-year-old woman had any business moving. She pulled me out of that car and hugged me so hard I felt it in my surgical stitches. Then she held me at arm's length and looked at my face, and whatever she saw there made her reach for her phone. She called Ryan. He answered. Of course he answered Dot's number. "Ryan Allen Ellis," she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had buried a husband and raised 3 sons, and was not afraid of a single thing left on this earth. "You look your mother in the eye and you tell her what you did, right now." I heard his voice through the phone, thin and distant. Excuses. Something about finances, about opportunity, about a fresh start. Dot held the phone toward me. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I reached out gently and pressed the end call button with my thumb. Dot stared at me. "He'll have his say eventually," I told her, "but not today." I reached back into the envelope and pulled out the $200. Then I unzipped my hospital bag and found what I was looking for, a small spiral notebook with a water-stained cover and pages soft from years of handling. My mother's handwriting covered every page, recipes, measurements, notes in the margins. "Add a little more butter than you think you need. Trust the smell, not the clock." I held the notebook and the money side by side in my lap. Ryan had taken the house. He had taken 31 years of furniture and photographs and the ceramic pot of geraniums on the porch. He had taken everything he could carry and everything he could sign his name to. He had not taken this. First African Baptist Church sat on a corner 2 miles from the house that no longer belonged to me, and Pastor James Whitfield was standing at the side entrance when Clara pulled up like he had been there for a while and didn't mind how long it took. He was a tall man somewhere in his 60s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago that most things worth doing could not be rushed. He opened my car door before I had a chance to reach for the handle. "Margaret," he said, "just my name, nothing else. Sometimes that's the only thing that needs saying." Clara carried my hospital bag inside. Pastor Whitfield led us down a narrow hallway that smelled like old wood and candle wax, and something I could only describe as permanence. The smell of a building that had been holding people together for longer than any of us had been alive. He stopped at a door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. The room was small. A single bed with a white quilt, a lamp on a nightstand, a window that looked out onto the church garden. A folding table against one wall with 2 chairs tucked beneath it. "It's not much," Pastor Whitfield said. "It's exactly enough," I told him. Clara hugged me at the door. She held on a beat longer than a nurse hugs a patient, and when she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "I'm off tomorrow," she said, "but I'll come by." She did. She always did. When the door closed, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. The church was quiet around me, the deep, particular quiet of a place that has absorbed a great deal of human pain and learned to hold it without breaking. I found that comforting in a way I hadn't expected. I reached into my bag and pulled out my mother's recipe notebook. The cover was soft from decades of handling. My mother had started it the year she was married, filling it in, her careful, unhurried script pralines, peach cobbler, cornbread, sweet potato pie, each recipe annotated with small notes in the margins. "Don't rush the sugar. Gerald always wanted extra cinnamon. This one is for hard days." I turned to that last note and read it twice. Then I set the notebook on the folding table and smoothed it open. I laid the $200 beside it. I found a pen in the bottom of my bag and a receipt I could write on the back of, and I started doing arithmetic the way my mother had taught me carefully from the beginning, leaving nothing out. Pecans, butter, brown sugar, cream, heavy-bottomed pot. The pralines alone could be made for under $30 a batch and sold for 3 times that if they were good enough. My mother's were good enough. I had been making them since I was 9 years old. Peach cobbler next. Forsyth Park Farmers Market opened at 8 on Saturday mornings. Today was Wednesday. I had 3 days. I wrote until the numbers made sense. Then I closed the notebook and capped the pen. A moment later, I heard Pastor Whitfield's voice in the hallway, low and unhurried the way he spoke about everything, making one more call before the night was done. I didn't know who he was calling then. I would find out on Saturday morning. I turned off the lamp. The room was dark, except for the light coming through the garden window, a thin silver line along the floor, steady and quiet. I looked at the $200 on the table one last time. You always land on your feet, Mom. For the first time, I thought Ryan was right about one thing. He just had no idea what kind of landing was coming. Before I continue, type Maggie in the comments and let me know you're still watching. What she built from nothing is something I still think about every single day. Please note portions of this story include fictional elements shaped for educational and storytelling purposes. If that's not your preference, this is a natural stopping point, but the best part is still ahead. Saturday came fast and cold the way Savannah mornings sometimes do in early spring. Bright skies, sharp air, the kind of morning that feels like a dare. I was at Forsyth Park by 6:30, 2 hours before the market opened, because I needed time to set up and because I could not sleep anyway. I carried everything in a rolling cart Pastor Whitfield had found in the church storage room, 2 sheet pans of pralines wrapped in wax paper, a deep dish of peach cobbler, still warm from the church kitchen, and my mother's recipe notebook tucked into the front pocket of my bag like a talisman. Earl Simmons was already there. I was a big man, 65 years old, with the kind of hands that came from decades of real work and a Vietnam veteran's cap he wore every single day, regardless of weather. He had a corner spot near the park's fountain that he had occupied for 11 years, selling honey and preserves, and Pastor Whitfield had called him the night before on my behalf. Earl looked me over the way a person does when they are deciding something important. Then he stuck out his hand. "Whitfield says you can cook," he said. "My mother could cook," I told him. I just paid attention. He almost smiled. "Take the left half of my table. We'll see how Saturday goes." In Georgia, selling homemade food at a farmer's market requires a valid cottage food permit, a license that allows individuals to prepare certain low-risk foods in a home kitchen and sell them directly to consumers. I had filed for mine 3 days earlier, the morning after I did my arithmetic on the back of that receipt, paying the filing fee with $40 of the $200 Ryan had left me. It was the first thing I spent his money on. It felt appropriate. By 8 o'clock, the market was filling up. I stood behind Earl's table with my pralines arranged on a cutting board and the cobbler in its dish, and my hands folded in front of me, watching people drift past with their coffee cups and their canvas bags, and I told myself that if I sold half of what I had brought, I could buy supplies for next Saturday. By 10 o'clock, everything was gone. I stood there looking at the empty cutting board, genuinely surprised, and Earl laughed, a short, low sound like a car engine turning over. "Told you," he said, though he hadn't told me anything of the sort. I made $54. I spent $38 on supplies for the following week and kept $16 for food. That was the whole business plan: buy, make, sell, repeat. And it worked the way simple things sometimes do better than anyone expects. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Saturday markets, then Wednesdays when the park hosted a smaller midweek crowd. Clara started coming by on her days off to help wrap and carry. Earl introduced me to the other vendors, people who had been selling at Forsyth Park for years and knew which customers wanted sweet and which wanted savory and which just wanted someone to talk to while they bought their jam. By the end of the second month, I had saved enough to buy a secondhand prep table and a proper display sign. By the third month, I had a waiting list for custom cobbler orders. That was the month Jake Turner walked into the market. He came in on a Tuesday, hands in his jacket pockets, moving like a man who had somewhere to be but had forgotten why he wanted to go there. He was 32 years old, though he looked younger with the distracted expression of someone whose mind was always running slightly ahead of his body. He had a food and culture channel online with nearly 400,000 followers, and he hadn't posted a single video in 11 weeks. He stopped in front of my table because of the smell. That was all. Just the smell. He bought a praline, ate it standing there, and then looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who has just been surprised by something they didn't know they needed. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You just did?" I told him. He laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that catches a person off guard. He sat down on the edge of Earl's empty cooler, and we talked for the better part of an hour about the recipes, about my mother, about the church kitchen, and the rolling cart, and the cottage food permit I had filed with $40 of someone else's bad conscience. I did not tell him everything, but I told him enough. At the end of it, he asked if he could come back on Saturday with a camera. "Not to review the food," he said quickly. "Just there's a story here, if you're willing." I looked at him for a long moment. He had the eager, slightly desperate energy of a person who had been creatively lost and had just spotted something that felt like north. "Saturday," I said. "Bring your own coffee. Jake showed up Saturday with a camera, a tripod, and 2 cups of coffee. One for him, one for me, black with 1 sugar, which I had not told him I preferred, but which was exactly right. He filmed for 3 hours. He didn't review the food. He didn't do a taste test on camera or hold up a praline and describe its flavor notes the way food creators usually did. He just pointed the camera at me and asked me to talk about my mother's recipes, about the church kitchen, about the rolling cart and the cottage food permit, and what it felt like to start over at 56 with $200 and a spiral notebook. I talked. I had not talked that honestly to anyone in months, and it turned out that honesty, when you finally let it out, moves like water. It finds every crack and fills it. Jake posted the video on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, it had 400,000 views. By Thursday, it had crossed 2 million. My phone, the same prepaid phone I had bought with $12 at a drugstore the week after leaving the hospital, rang so many times, I eventually set it face down on Earl's cooler and left it there. People drove to Forsyth Park from 3 counties over. Earl had to help me manage the line. Clara took 2 days off work and stood beside me for 8 hours straight, wrapping pralines in wax paper and thanking customers and pretending she wasn't crying at least twice that I noticed. 2 weeks after the video posted, Linda Marsh walked up to my table. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, carrying a leather notebook and the particular expression of a journalist who has already decided the story is worth telling and just needs the subject to confirm it. She introduced herself as a senior editor at Savannah magazine and said she wanted to write a profile. "About the food?" I asked. "About you," she said. The article ran 6 weeks later under the title, "Starting Over, How One Savannah Woman Turned $200 into Something Nobody Expected." Linda wrote it the way good journalists write. She let the facts carry the emotion and trusted her readers to feel what she didn't say outright. She mentioned the hospital. She mentioned the $200. She did not mention Ryan by name because I asked her not to, and she respected that without pushing. The week the article came out, I registered Ellis Southern Suites as an LLC in the state of Georgia. Jake helped me set up a proper website. Clara quit the hospital. She called me the night before her last shift, sounding more nervous than I had ever heard her. "I just want to make sure you actually need me," she said. "I don't want to leave a job for a maybe." "Clara," I said, "I needed you before I even had a business." She started the following Monday. The first location was a small storefront on Whitaker Street, 6 tables, an open kitchen, the menu written on a chalkboard above the counter. We served pralines, cobbler, cornbread, sweet potato pie, and 3 rotating daily specials from my mother's notebook. The line went out the door on opening day and didn't shorten for 3 weeks. Year 2, we opened a second location on Broughton Street. Year 3, Augusta. Year 4, Atlanta. By year 5, Ellis Southern Suites had 4 locations, 41 employees, a catering division, and a 6-month wait list for private events. Jake became our creative partner, content branding the visual language of everything we put into the world. He was good at it in a way he hadn't been before, and he said once quietly that Ellis Southern Suites had given him back something he thought he'd permanently lost. I told him we were even then. I bought a house in the 3rd year, small 2 bedrooms, a backyard with enough room for a garden. The closing attorney handed me the keys across a conference table, and I held them in my palm for a long moment before I put them in my pocket. That night I sat at my kitchen table, my table in my kitchen in my house, and opened my mother's recipe notebook to the last page, the page I had written on the night at the church. "Mom, I'm going to use everything you taught me." Beneath it, I wrote one more line. I did. Then I closed the notebook and sat quietly in the kitchen for a while. The house made the small sounds new houses make, settling, adjusting, getting used to the person inside it. Somewhere across 2 states, I had a son I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. I noticed sitting there that the thought arrived without the sharp edge it used to carry. It was still there. It had simply stopped bleeding. Before I tell you what 7 words in a magazine article did to a 17-year-old girl on a Thursday night in October, comment, "I'm staying, so I know you're with me." Because what Sophie did next took more courage than most adults ever find. A gentle reminder. Some elements of this story have been shaped for storytelling and educational purposes. You're free to step away right here, but what's coming next is the moment everything changes. I never went looking for Ryan. In 8 years, I did not drive past his neighborhood or search his name or wonder out loud what his life looked like now. I had made a decision on the night I sat in that church room with $200 and my mother's recipe book, and the decision was this: I would spend whatever time I had left building forward, not looking back. Some decisions once made hold. What I did not plan for was Sophie. She told me the whole story herself later, sitting at one of the tables in the Whitaker Street location after closing time. Her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, talking the way young people talk when they have been carrying something heavy and have finally found someone safe enough to set it down with. Sophie Ellis was 17 years old, a junior at a high school outside Raleigh, North Carolina, and she was working on a paper for her AP English class. The assignment was straightforward research, a woman who had rebuilt her life after a significant setback, and write a 1,200-word analytical essay about resilience. Her teacher had suggested athletes, politicians, scientists. Sophie had gone looking on her own. She found Linda Marsh's article on a Thursday night in October, 3 weeks before the paper was due. She had been searching for hours and was about to give up when the headline came up in her results. Starting over, how one Savannah woman turned $200 into something nobody expected. She almost scrolled past it. She clicked it instead the way you sometimes click on things for no reason you can name. She read the whole article in one sitting. She read about the hospital stay, about the $200, about the farmer's market, and Earl and the rolling cart from the church storage room. She read about Jake Turner's video and the line out the door on opening day, and the 4 locations, and the 41 employees. Then she read a sentence near the end of the article, a quote Linda had pulled from our interview, one I barely remembered saying, and her hands went still on her keyboard. "Someone left me a note once," the article quoted me as saying. 7 words, "You always land on your feet, Mom." I thought about those words a lot in those early days, not because they were kind, because I was determined to prove they were right in a way the person who wrote them never imagined. Sophie read that sentence 3 times. Then she pushed her chair back from her desk and sat very still in her bedroom in Raleigh, North Carolina, while something she had half known for years finished arranging itself into a shape she could no longer pretend not to see. She was 9 years old when she had heard her father say those words. She had been supposed to be asleep. She was not asleep. She was sitting at the top of the stairs in her pajamas with the cartoon planets on them, watching the light from the kitchen fall across the hallway floor, listening to her parents talk in the low, urgent voices adults use when they think no one is listening. She had not understood most of what they said, but she had heard her father's voice say clearly, distinctly, in the particular tone he used when he wanted to sound more certain than he was, "She always lands on her feet." And she had heard her mother say something short and quiet in response, and then the kitchen light had gone out, and Sophie had gone back to bed and filed the memory away in the place where children store the things they are not yet old enough to understand. 8 years later, sitting at her desk in October, she understood. She pulled up every article she could find about Ellis Southern Sweets. She found Jake Turner's original video and watched it twice, leaning close to her laptop screen. She found the follow-up pieces, the local news segments, the mention in a Georgia food magazine. In every photograph, a woman with steady eyes and flour on her apron stood in a kitchen that she had clearly built one careful decision at a time. My granddaughter told me later that she cried looking at those photographs. Not from sadness, she said. From something she did not have a word for, yet the feeling of finding something you did not know was lost. She waited 4 days before she said anything to Ryan. She was not afraid of her father, she told me. She simply wanted to be sure. She checked dates, cross-referenced details, reread the article 3 more times. When she was certain, completely irreversibly certain, she closed her laptop and went downstairs. It was a Sunday evening. Ryan was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper he still insisted on having delivered in print, a habit Sophie had always found endearing and now found she could not look at without feeling something complicated twist in her chest. She set her phone on the table in front of him. On the screen was Linda Marsh's article open to the photograph of me standing in the Whitaker Street kitchen on opening day. "Dad," she said, "who is this?" Ryan looked at the screen. Sophie told me later that she had expected denial. She had prepared for it, rehearsed her response, had the dates and the details lined up in her mind like evidence. What she had not prepared for was what actually happened. Ryan put down his coffee cup. He looked at the photograph for a long moment without speaking. Then with the slow, effortful movement of a man whose body has suddenly become very heavy. He folded the newspaper, set it aside and covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook. Sophie had never seen her father cry. Not at funerals, not during the hard years when his first business failed, not once in 17 years of watching him move through the world with the careful composure of a man who had decided early that showing weakness cost too much. He cried now. Deep, ragged, the kind of crying that has been stored up for a long time in a very small space. Diane came in from the living room and stopped in the doorway. She looked at the phone screen. She looked at Ryan. She set her hand on the doorframe like she needed something to hold on to. Nobody spoke for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then went quiet. Finally, Ryan lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red and swollen, and when he looked at his daughter, he looked like a man who had just put something down that he had been carrying for 8 years and was only now feeling how heavy it had actually been. "Sophie," he said. His voice came out broken and unsteady, and nothing like his usual voice. "I don't know if she'll want to see me." He stopped, swallowed. "But she might want to see you." Sophie told me she nodded, that she didn't trust her own voice right then. She went back upstairs, sat at her desk, and opened a new document. She didn't write her AP English essay that night. She wrote me a letter instead. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, not an email. An actual letter handwritten on notebook paper in the careful, slightly crowded script of someone who had started over twice on the same page before deciding this version was good enough. The envelope had a Raleigh postmark and no return address, as though the sender had not yet decided whether she wanted a response or simply needed the act of sending it. I read it standing at the front counter of the Whitaker Street location before we opened, still in my apron with the morning light coming through the front windows, and Clara pretending to restock the display case 6 feet away while very obviously listening. Sophie introduced herself. She explained how she had found the article. She described the night at the kitchen table with her father. She did not make excuses for Ryan or for Diane. She did not ask me to forgive anyone. She simply said that she had spent 17 years not knowing I existed in any real way, and that she thought that was probably a loss for both of us, and that if I was ever willing to meet her, she would drive down from Raleigh any weekend I named. At the bottom of the page below her phone number, she had written one more line. "I don't need you to be okay with any of it. I just want to know you if you'll let me." I folded the letter. Clara was suddenly very busy with the display case. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Clara said without turning around. "She does," I said. I called the number that afternoon. Sophie answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. We talked for 40 minutes. She was direct and careful and occasionally funny in a dry, understated way that reminded me of nobody I could immediately place, and then with a small internal jolt, reminded me of myself at that age. We agreed on a Saturday 2 weeks out. I told her to come to the Whitaker Street location at 10 in the morning and ask for Clara at the door. She arrived at 9:45. I was in the kitchen when Clara knocked twice on the doorframe, our signal. I took off my apron, hung it on the hook by the oven, and walked out to the front of the house. Sophie Ellis was standing just inside the door with her hands in the front pocket of her hoodie and the careful posture of someone trying very hard to appear less nervous than she was. She was tall, with Ryan's dark hair, and something around the eyes that I recognized, with a force I had not expected her grandfather's eyes. Gerald's eyes. The same shape, the same particular quality of attention, the way they moved around a room like they were genuinely interested in what they found there. She saw me, and her breath caught. I saw it, the small visible hitch in her chest. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the empty restaurant, the morning light falling between us, 8 years and 500 miles, and everything that had happened, compressed into the 10 feet of hardwood floor we were standing on opposite ends of. Then Sophie said, her voice coming out smaller than she probably intended, "I've been practicing what to say for 2 weeks." "So have I told her. "Neither of us is going to get it right. Come here anyway." She crossed the room, and I put my arms around my granddaughter for the first time, and she was taller than I had imagined, and she smelled like the kind of drugstore shampoo that young people buy because they have not yet discovered that spending a little more is worth it, and she held on with the particular grip of someone who has needed a hug for a very long time and is only now allowing themselves to have one. Clara disappeared into the back without a word. She had the good sense to know when she wasn't needed. I showed Sophie everything. We started in the kitchen, the prep stations, the heavy-bottomed pots my mother would have recognized the chalkboard above the pass-through where we wrote the daily specials in Clara's careful handwriting. I showed her the walk-in cooler and the shelf where I kept my mother's recipe notebook in a Ziploc bag because the kitchen humidity was hard on old paper. Sophie asked if she could look at it. I handed it to her. She turned the pages slowly, reading the marginal notes, tracing the older recipes with one finger. When she got to the page with my mother's note, "This one is for hard days," she stopped. "Did it work?" she asked. "On the hard days." "Every time," I said. She nodded and handed the notebook back with both hands carefully, like it was something that deserved to be treated carefully. I decided then that she was someone who understood the weight of things without being told. We sat at the corner table with coffee and a plate of pralines and talked for 2 hours. She told me about school, about the AP English paper she had eventually finished. She got an A, she mentioned with the slightly embarrassed pride of someone who thinks caring about grades is less cool than it actually is. She told me about wanting to study business, about not being sure if that was what she actually wanted or just what made sense. I told her that those two things were rarely the same and that it was worth taking the time to find out which was which. At some point, Clara came back out with fresh coffee and joined us at the table because Clara had never been good at staying away from a conversation she found interesting, and this one she found very interesting indeed. The three of us sat there in the quiet of the closed restaurant while the morning moved past the windows outside, and it felt in the way that very few things feel exactly like what it was. Sophie looked around the restaurant at one point at the framed photographs on the wall, the menu on the chalkboard, the light coming through the front windows onto the wood floors, and said quietly, "You built all of this." "We did," I said, and nodded toward Clara. "Still," Sophie said. She looked back at me. "With $200 and a recipe book." "And a church storage room cart," Clara added. "Don't forget the cart." Sophie laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it filled the room in a way that made Clara grin and made something in my chest loosen that I had not realized was still pulled tight. Before she left, Sophie stood at the door with her keys in her hand and looked at me with the direct, slightly anxious expression of someone about to ask a question they are not sure they have the right to ask. "My dad wants to come," she said. He doesn't expect anything. He just—" She stopped. Tried again. "He asked me to ask you if it would ever be possible." I looked at my granddaughter in the doorway. Behind her through the window, Savannah was going about its Saturday morning people with coffee cups, a dog on a leash, the oak trees moving slightly in the October breeze. I thought about the porch, the envelope, the 7 words. I thought about the church room and the recipe notebook and the rolling cart and every single day of 8 years that had passed between that moment and this one. "Tell him I'll be here," I said. "But tell him he needs to come ready to tell the truth. Not the version that makes him feel better, the actual truth." Sophie nodded. She understood the difference. I could see that she did. She walked to her car, and I stood in the doorway of my restaurant and watched her go, and when she reached the sidewalk, she turned back once and raised her hand. I raised mine. Clara appeared at my shoulder. "So," she said. "So," I said. "You okay?" I thought about it honestly, the way I had learned to think about things in the years since the porch and the envelope and the $200. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually am." They came on a Tuesday morning in November, which surprised me. I had expected a Saturday neutral ground public hours, the safety of other people nearby. But Ryan called the night before and asked if Tuesday morning would work before we opened, and something in his voice told me he did not want an audience for this. I said Tuesday was fine. I was alone in the kitchen when Clara knocked twice on the doorframe. "They're here," she said. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on the morning of my discharge from the hospital 8 years ago, like she was prepared to stay or go, whichever I needed. I told her to go. She squeezed my arm once and disappeared into the back. Ryan walked in first. 8 years had changed him in the ways that 8 years of carrying something heavy will change a person. His hair had gone mostly gray at the temples. He moved carefully like a man who had learned to take up less space than he used to. Diane followed 2 steps behind him, her hands clasped in front of her, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed composure and is hoping it holds. Sophie was not with them. That had been her choice, she told me later. She thought we needed the room. Ryan stopped in the middle of the restaurant floor. He looked around at the chalkboard menu, the framed photographs, the morning light on the wood floors, and his jaw worked for a moment before he found his voice. "I didn't know," he said. "I mean, I knew you'd manage. I told myself you'd manage." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I didn't know it would be this." I didn't answer. I walked to the door and held it open. "Come with me," I said. I took them through everything. The kitchen, the prep stations, the walk-in cooler, the shelf where I kept my mother's recipe notebook. I showed them the photograph on the wall from opening day, me and Clara and Earl standing in front of the Whitaker Street sign, all 3 of us squinting into the sun. I showed them the framed copy of Linda Marsh's article. I showed them the employee board with 41 names on it. Ryan looked at the board for a long time without speaking. His eyes moved down the list slowly, the way you read something you need to understand completely before you respond to it. Then he reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. He held it out to me. I looked at it but didn't take it. "It's a cashier's check," he said. "Everything from the sale plus 8 years of interest. I had an accountant calculate it." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I know it doesn't fix anything. It was never my money." I looked at my son standing in the kitchen I had built with $200 of his bad conscience holding money he had carried for 8 years like a stone in his chest, and I felt something move through me that was not quite forgiveness and not quite anger, but something older and quieter than either. "Ryan," I said, "the woman you left on that porch built all of this." I looked around the kitchen once, then back at him. "She doesn't need your money. She never did." He lowered his hand. His eyes filled, and he didn't try to stop it. Diane stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was steady in the way that costs something. "I helped him do it," she said. "I told myself it was practical, that you were tough enough." She stopped. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong, and I did it anyway, and I am sorry, Margaret. Not because of what you became, because of what we did." The kitchen was very quiet. I looked at my son and my daughter-in-law standing in the middle of everything I had built without them, and I thought about my mother's notebook and the church storage room cart and the first Saturday at Forsyth Park and Earl's hand extended across the table and Clara staying past the end of every shift and Jake Turner sitting on a cooler for an hour because a smell stopped him in his tracks. I thought about Sophie raising her hand at the curb. "Keep the money," I told Ryan. "Use it for something that helps someone." I paused. "And come back. Not to fix what happened. Just to be here now. That's all I'm asking." Ryan nodded. He couldn't speak. He nodded again, and that was enough. Forgiveness didn't come in a single day. It wasn't a single conversation, not a dramatic hug, not a cashier's check rejected or accepted. Forgiveness arrived little by little through Tuesday mornings when Ryan dropped by before we opened, through weekends, when Sophie drove down to Savannah and learned to make pralines with awkward but patient hands, and through short texts from Diane with no excuses added, just the steady presence of someone trying to do better. If you are listening to this today, and someone has made you feel like your story is over, like the worst thing that happened to you is the last thing that will ever define you, I want you to hear this clearly. They were wrong. People can take your house. They can take your savings, your furniture, your certainty about the future. They can leave you with $200 and 7 words and a porch that no longer belongs to you. But they cannot take what you know how to do. They cannot take the recipes your mother wrote in the margins of a spiral notebook. They cannot take the decision you make in a quiet church room at the end of the worst day of your life. That decision belongs to you. It always will. If this story reached you today, I'd love to know what it meant to you. Leave a comment, especially if you've ever had to start over when starting over felt impossible. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you want more stories about Resilience Family and the quiet kind of justice that takes years to arrive, subscribe and stay with us. There's always another story worth telling. I have told you my story, and I want to be honest with you the way I wish someone had been honest with me. I kept quiet for too long. I did not call a lawyer. I did not protect myself. If you are living through something similar right now, please do not make my mistake. Document everything. Talk to an attorney before you trust anyone with a power of attorney, even your own children. Silence is not strength. It is just silence. People call stories like mine revenge stories with mom, a mother wronged a mother rising. I understand why. But I do not think of my life as revenge. I think of it as a second chance I almost did not believe I deserved. I believe God places certain people in our path at exactly the right moment. Clara, Pastor Whitfield, Earl, Jake, none of them arrived by accident. There are thousands of family revenge stories told every day. Most end with courtrooms and confrontations. Mine ended with pralines on a Tuesday morning, and my son finally telling the truth. I believe that is better. Quiet justice built with your own hands lasts longer than anything a courtroom could give you. If these revenge stories with mom and family revenge stories have stayed with you today, leave a comment. Tell me what part felt most familiar. Share this with someone who needs to hear that starting over is still possible. And if you want more family revenge stories about resilience and quiet justice, subscribe and stay with us. There is always another story worth telling. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end.